So welcome to the Scottish Economic Society Tercentenary Adam Smith Lecture. And I'm delighted to welcome Professor Rajan from Chicago Booth to give the lecture. Raghu is the Catherine Dusac Miller Distinguished Professor of Finance at Chicago Booth. Raghu, as you know, has published very widely and of course influentially in the areas of finance, banking and monetary policy. Amongst his many accolades, he's been president of the American Finance Association and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's also been recognized many times inside and outside the academic profession for his research papers and books. He's authored highly successful and award-winning books, including his book on the 2008 crisis, Fault Lines. So in a crowded field, it was the book that won the prestigious 2010 FT Goldman Sachs Book of the Year. And if that's not enough, Raghu has also played and continues to play many policy roles. He's been Chief Economist and Director of Research at the International Monetary Fund. He's been Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and he's held many other senior policy roles. His most recent book, I think, is The Third Pillar, How the State and Markets Hold the Community Behind, and that was a finalist for the Financial Times Business Book of the Year. So Raghu's going to talk for maybe 50 or so minutes, and then we'll try and fit in a few questions. So it's a great pleasure to invite Professor Rajan to give the Scottish Economic Society Tercentenary Adam Smith Lecture 2023.
Thank you, Charles. It's such a pleasure being here on this occasion, and thanks for inviting me. What I want to talk about is what's up there, the objectives of the modern corporation. And the reason this is important, and for that I need to find the clicker. Okay, yes. The reason this is important is we have huge problems nowadays in society, exacerbated, of course, by the pandemic. One of the issues I talked about in the third pillar was left behind communities, their racial disparities, and of course, we have this massive issue of climate change which is upon us, and we have done precious little about it. And at the same time, we have paralyzed governments who don't seem to be able to get their act together. And there's immense pressure, therefore, on corporations to step up. If the public sector cannot do it, maybe the private sector can help. And so the ESG movement, environment, social, governance, has gained steam. And the idea is somehow this enormous source of power in the private sector can be galvanized to step up and solve public problems. Now, what I want to talk about today is really a talk in two parts, and maybe there's one part too many for the time I have. But it's starting with some historical thinking on corporations. And I want to argue that, even right from the time of Adam Smith, there's really been three parties to this kind of debate. One is the owner of the public corporation. By public, I mean the privately held public limited corporation. So there's the owner, there's the manager, and there's the public purpose. These three elements are important, and they've always been somewhat at odds with each other in an attempt to improve the private incentives of managers to work for the owners. Sometimes you reduce the incentive to work for the public purpose, and vice versa. We'll come to that. But we'll see that the debate has always been centered around the private incentives and public purpose between these three agents, the public, managers, and owners. And then I want to come to the second part, which is what do we know about what corporations in the US are doing today? And I'll give you some evidence. And I'll ask, have we sort of answered the questions, these how do we balance these pressures in a suitable way? And the answer, unfortunately, is going to be maybe, but don't expect too much from corporations to solve public problems that governments eventually have to step up. It can't be the private sector which does it. So that's where we're going. Let me start first with Adam Smith. Clearly, 300 years since his birth. 300 years ago, maybe 250 with the publication of The Wealth of Nations. His view on corporations is very modern. In the sense that he was skeptical, as is generally the broader public today. But his reason for skepticism was twofold. One, he thought they were extremely inefficient. And he thought that because of the inefficiency, they required monopoly privileges. And so he pointed first to inefficiency, the fact that, these companies repeatedly failed. The specific companies he had in mind, the Royal African Company, was essentially a slave trading company. Similarly, the South Sea Company, famous for the South Sea bubble, it too, its primary business was trading slaves from Africa to South America when it had a business, and it wasn't particularly successful at it either. And both these companies weren't particularly good in terms of survival or profitability, and despite being granted privileges, in fact, he said, the reason they were granted privileges is they couldn't compete on their own against privately owned firms, that is, not public corporations. And so the inefficiency, he said, is because of what we now call agency costs. And he had some very colorful language on this. The company shareholders were dispersed and were dependent on corporate management to deliver on their behalf. And, he said, look, the directors of such companies, being managers of other people's money than their own, can't be expected to watch over it, I'm paraphrasing, with the same anxious vigilance with which the partners in a private co-partnery frequently watch over their own. In other words, they don't have the right incentives. And these famous words, like the stewards of a rich man, they're apt to consider attention to small matters as not for their master's honor. They don't pay attention to detail because it's not their money. And as a result, their wasteful, negligence, and profusion must always prevail, more or less, in the management of such a company. And then he concludes by saying, it is upon this account that joint stock companies for foreign trade have seldom been able to maintain the competition against private adventurers. They're inefficient. They have accordingly very seldom succeeded without an exclusive privilege, and frequently have not succeeded even with one. So in other words, look, they're bad, they're poor entities. We should probably not look to them. Smith was worried about two main issues, undue privilege, that they're looking for monopoly, and agency costs, that is, perhaps managers, if they were owners, as in a partnership, would be better. Both these issues are still with us. Do these companies look for undue privilege? Is there excessive concentration in industry? Is there enough competition? And second, do the managers work for the shareholders? And increasingly today, do they work for the public purpose? Now, let's move on in the debate, maybe 150, 200 years from Smith. Burley and Means in The Modern Corporation and Private Property, which was published in the middle of the Depression in 1932, essentially argued that Adam Smith's fears had come to pass. Corporations had been too successful, a little differentiated from Adam Smith. They now dominated every industry, but there were only a few of them dominating. So they were large corporations. And that exacerbated the agency problem because you had small shareholders owning large corporations, as a result of which the managers paid no attention to the owners. So the Burley and Means problem was the rights of the shareholders had been eradicated, and therefore their answer was to push for the rights of the minority shareholder because every shareholder was a minority now, given that these were large publicly financed corporations. So their concern was, again, the agency problem. Again, skip forward another 40 years to Milton Friedman. Friedman basically said, the agency problem is even worse because these managers are now trying to do good. And that is terrible because, these famous words, businessmen believe they're defending free enterprise when they claim they're concerned with promoting desirable social ends, like providing employment, eliminating discrimination, avoiding pollution, and whatever else may be the catchwords of the contemporary crop of reformers. So he basically said, look, they're trying to do good, and he's concluded this is pure, undiluted socialism. What did he mean by that? Basically, he felt that anything political was socialism. These guys should forget about doing good, focus on making money. He was particularly angry at that time because the Johnson administration was exhorting companies to stop raising prices as a cure to inflation. And of course, Friedman thought that part of the cure for inflation was higher prices. Once people saw that the goods in high demand were priced more highly, they would stop demanding so much, and that would be part of the prices were part of the cure, and he was trying to curb that. Of course, he also believed that the government was responsible for inflation, not corporations, and hounding corporations to stop raising prices was really a terrible solution. So, but this sort of drove his broader sense that politically forcing decisions on managers was a bad thing, that vested interests were pushing on corporations what they cannot get through Congress. And so this was a terrible way of managing corporations, which led him to basically say, stop this trying to do public good. Your job, there is only one social responsibility of business, to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. This is a famous sentence, but it doesn't end there, because he also tries to address the other issue that Smith was worried about, which was monopoly. So he was against undue privilege. He wanted competition. He was very pro-competition. So he adds this, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. So he's not saying, bilk the customer by selling shoddy goods. He's saying, do the best you can, but staying within the rules of the game. Of course, Friedman doesn't tell you how the rules of the game are made. He sort of assumes them. And we'll come to that in just a second. So if you think about what Friedman is saying, he says, essentially, shareholder value maximization is what companies should engage in. This maximizes efficiency, deals in part with the Adam Smith problem by assuming it away, by saying if managers act as if they're shareholders, that is going to be really good for efficiency. And we have some literature on why that may be more or less true. I'll come to the less in a bit, but basically, if shareholders capture the present value of long-term profits, and you assume that everyone else is a fixed claimant on the firm, maximizing shareholder value is like maximizing the size of the pie, because you're maximizing the residual value, and therefore you're maximizing the whole pie. And it doesn't obviously mean that the company is run into the ground for the benefit of the shareholders' short-term interests. Good customer service or investing in the community is not ruled out. It can be part of shareholder value maximization because it adds to the bottom line over time. So in this kind of view, stakeholders are derived objectives. They sort of, yes, I care about my employees, yes, I care about my customer, but because by caring about them, I improve long-term value, okay? So what about agency costs, right? So does Friedman sort of assume away the agency cost by assuming the shareholders maximize shareholder value? And in a sense, he does. But you can sort of restore them in some ways. Michael Jensen and Murphy wrote a piece in 1990 saying, one of the problems is that managers have very little stake. And one way to essentially make them behave like owners is to give them more wealth in the company by giving them large stock holdings. And of course, this created a huge push from corporate management to give themselves large pay in stock, because that was, after all, what the theorists said should be the right thing. They should be paid in stock so that they have the right incentives. But it created another kind of agency problem, which is pay for non-performance, pet boards that essentially paid huge sums of money for managers despite them not providing shareholder value. But also it created the problem of perverse incentives, as we saw with Silicon Valley Bank. Managers had big bonuses in performance, so they took short-term profits, which created long-term problems for the corporation. But broadly, Friedman's sense was maximize shareholder value, align the interests of shareholders and managers by making them more of a co-partnery, as Smith said, giving managers more stock. But I think the bigger problem with Friedman is that the second part. How do you ensure that firms engage in free and fair competition? In fact, why would they? If they are incentivized to maximize shareholder value, would they not want to kill competition? And he wants the rules of the game to be set by democracy, with corporations not playing a part. And this leads to the question, was he naive? Or did he just assume away the problem? That politics don't matter, that lobbying doesn't take place, that this is not something for economists to worry about. In fact, you would think this is a central problem. It's, after all, political economy, right? How do we keep the rules of the game fair so that it's a level playing field? And how do corporations not manage the rules of the game in their favor? We'll come back to this in a second, but an alternative to Friedman is the purposive, progressive / stakeholder view. These are different ways of saying the same thing. There are lots of people saying companies should have a purpose. Another group of people saying you should worry about stakeholders. And broadly, this is a very progressive view. This, again, I'm simplifying and therefore perhaps caricaturing the view a little. It agrees with Smith that firms shouldn't be given privileged monopolies. And one way is, what is in the US called Brandeisian antitrust, basically keep firms from dominating, regardless of what the consequences or the causes of that domination are. Just stop them from dominating industries, stop them from going across industries, and that will be part of the solution. There's also, I think they point to a very fundamental contradiction we've already come to between Smith's first and second concern, which is in the process of getting managers to behave as their owners, could you exacerbate the second problem, which is make them more greedy for monopoly, because monopoly is the way you make larger profits? And isn't there a tension between the two? In fact, one of the most famous texts on corporate greed and monopoly is Ida Tarbell's History of the Standard Oil Corporation. She wrote in the early 1900s, and this was a takedown of Standard Oil. Very brave. She was part of what was then called the muckraker press in the United States. But her main concern was not that Standard Oil was inefficient. She said this is one of the most efficient companies in the world. What she felt disillusioned by was the fact that despite their efficiency, they still wanted to create a monopoly by using the rules of the game, bribing legislatures, etc., to try and get their monopoly. And that was, one example of the private sector being really efficient, motivated by profits, but not stopping at Friedman's, free and fair competition, but in fact changing the rules of the game to make it work much more for them. And there are many examples today which we can go into, but for the sake of time, I won't. I'll come to one more example in just a second. So the progressive view is very right about this, that there is no separation between the two. How do you keep private interest from distorting the public purpose? But the second point is more troublesome for the progressive view. They want managers to work for the broader interests, for stakeholders, for society. How do you get managers to do that becomes a central question. This sense is, somehow managers are angels. But are managers really angels? How do you make them angels? One example of this, the fluffiness in this discussion is the Business Roundtable statement in 2019. This Business Roundtable is a group of really big businesses in the US. And their statement is, each of our stakeholders is essential. We commit to deliver value to all of them for the future success of our companies, our communities, and our country. What a statement. Who would disagree with it? In fact, it has no content, right? If you're going to be nice to everyone, if everyone is essential, no one is. This is a fluffy statement, but it is the problem with thinking managers are angels. There is no sense of how they would prioritize given this statement. In fact, one of the interesting anecdotes is, the Shell CEO's daughter basically sees he's signed on to the statement, and it has nothing about Shell providing a valuable service in its own right. So she says, why don't you sell the company and give the proceeds to Greenpeace? Won't you be helping solve humanity's problems? And, in actual fact, there's nothing in the statement which says you won't do that, because nothing says you're making a valuable product, and that's part of what you're doing. You're going to be nice to everyone, and there's no prioritization. So why not sell and give the proceeds to Greenpeace? The point here is that this kind of fluff raises the potential for agency problems in spades. Who holds the management to account, and for what? What is good? Who defines good? And this was Friedman's original sort of concern. You're defining good, which includes contributing to the New York Philharmonic because you have a seat on the board and you're treated well by the Philharmonic, but why is that in the interests of the company? So who holds management to account for what? And why would we trust management to be angelic? And we've already seen some of the problems of doing this with the platforms, the internet platforms, and we trusted them to do self-policing on content. Look how well that's turned out. And so I think the point here is that you cannot delegate all this and believe they will deliver. Now, there are in-between positions between the Friedman maximize shareholder value, the stakeholder value, think about society, et cetera. The stakeholder value tries to solve the problem within private interest and public purpose by defining the private interest as public purpose. You guys should manage as if you're part of society. Friedman says, forget the public purpose, focus only on private interest. There are things which try and bridge the two a little bit. One is the notion that stakeholders should be interim goals and should be explicitly defined. So think about, for example, the situation that Google found itself in. Google had this Project Maven. Project Maven was AI to basically identify the effects of to help drones target better military targets. And basically, Google's employees said, we're not going to work on this, because this could mean bombing innocent people, obliterating them. We don't think that is good. And part of your objective as a corporation is do no evil. We're not going to participate in this. So Google had this choice. Do we support our employees and reject one of our big customers, the Department of Defense, or do we support the Department of Defense and say employees do what they're told? And they sided in favor of the employees, rejected Project Maven. That was then. Maybe they've changed a lot since. But given that, there is a logic behind that which is consistent with shareholder value maximization, which is saying our most valuable resource are our employees. We want to keep them. And if we can show that we do things which are consistent with employee preferences, Perhaps they come because they see a compensating differential in coming to Google and taking a position here because we're doing good. And as a result, and this is the more cynical view, but which is towards shareholder value maximization, they accept lower compensation, they stay here longer, we retain them better, and that increases shareholder value. So in this view, basically stakeholders are interim goals on the way to long-term shareholder value maximization. And therefore, announcing we care about these stakeholders explicitly is a good thing because it shows you care about them and it maximizes overall value. So that's the stakeholders as interim goals view, which sort of is in between the shareholder and stakeholder view. A second view is what is called shareholder preferences. And this is something Luigi, my often co-author, and Oliver Hart have put out. Basically, Friedman says we maximize shareholder value, and by creating the maximum value for shareholders, we give them the ability to use the value that's embedded in their stock to do whatever they want, including good. They want to give to charity, let them sell some of their stock, whose value we've maximized, and give to the charity of their choice. Companies should not give to charity, right? So that's the Friedman view, let's maximize value for owners. But Luigi and Oliver basically raised the question, well, but maybe shareholders don't care only about the value of their shares, they care about social outcomes. So let's say you have shareholders who care about gun violence. They want to reduce gun violence. Well, Friedman would say, if you're an owner of Walmart, let Walmart sell as many guns as possible in the market, maximize Walmart's share price, and then the shareholders of Walmart will go sell those shares, use that money to buy back the guns. This is a terribly inefficient process, right? Why not stop Walmart from selling those guns in the first place? Let's ignore the fact that others may step up and sell guns, but supposing Walmart was a monopolist, could you stop gun violence by stopping Walmart from selling guns? And their view is yes. That would be more efficient than this two-step process. So maybe companies should listen to shareholder preferences and do the right thing. Well, the problem is, how do you elicit shareholder preferences? Whose preferences? The virtue about value maximization is it's all in money. It's all fungible. But with preferences, less fungible. Supposing 40% want this, 40% want something else, and 20% want a third thing, what does the corporation do? That becomes a lot more problematic. But I think corporations are moving towards this, as I'll come to in the data in just a moment. They are listening to their shareholders and their preferences and doing what shareholders want. So what is the bottom line here? The bottom line is very unsatisfactory because these two issues that Adam Smith pointed to, the private agency problem and the public purpose problem, broadly the monopoly problem and the incentive problem, basically have solutions which don't match. Solve one, create a problem for the other. Solve the other, create a problem for the first, right? And we still are in this situation. For example, on monopolization, we still are dealing with the problem of big monopolies in the US, in the UK. Oligopolistic profits are high. Obviously, there's a lot of debate, is this really oligopolistic profits or not? But you would say, certainly in some industries, healthcare in the United States, for example, it is. So how do you save capitalism from the capitalists? That's the big problem that we still have, and somehow the answer is not a clean one. It's in politics. Separate from what Friedman said, it is found in politics. It is balancing different fractions and hoping that balance between factions as well as competition from the outside will keep the domestic system on the straight and narrow. So on the balancing between factions, we've seen in the US initially, Roosevelt administration onwards, right till the 70s, the Brandeisian view of antitrust used to prevail. Then there was the Chicago view or the Borkian view of antitrust, which was more consumer-focused, which allowed the rise of large corporations. Now we have a reaction. Lina Khan, as part of the FTC, she's well and truly squarely in the Brandeisian view again. So maybe this Madison view that factions will keep politics broadly under control, different parties will have their preferences, and if things go too much to one side, there will be competition. In other words, politics is the answer, not the problem. And the political forces will keep things in balance. The second is competition between systems. When the system goes really off track and becomes inefficient, competition from outside, from other systems, comes to put the system back on the straight and narrow, and both these may really be part of the answer for the first problem, which is the politics. The second, on agency problems, really, we're still struggling with it. We've learned how to incentivize management, but we know that this can go too far. Giving them stock is a good answer, but how do you prevent them from taking too much stock under the guise that they need incentives? And when does a focus on shareholder value become distortionary? We've seen that also happen. And of course, today, what about the externalities associated with corporations? Emissions, diversity and inclusion. These are important places corporations can play a role. But here again, how do we get corporations to take these into account? And I think the bottom line I'm coming to is back to political economy. You need a vibrant political environment which can get reasonable solutions from corporations. But in a sense, wasn't that the problem we were trying to solve in the first place? That the environment wasn't vibrant, wasn't capable of providing solutions, and we wanted corporations to step up? That's what I'm going to sort of, once we go through the evidence, conclude with, that the real problem is that you cannot get corporations to step up, to substitute for government, because government is necessary to keep corporations also on the straight and narrow. And in a sense, you can have both being dysfunctional with neither sort of stepping up to the plate. And you can't rely on one to fix the other. You need both in a sense. And that's something I'll come back to. So I'm going to leave this section on theories to get to evidence on what US corporations do now. And this is based on work I've done with Luigi Zingales and Pietro Ramella, who's a PhD student at Chicago. And I want to argue that what we see today is extensive muddling through as far as corporations go. There's no neat solution, unlike what these theories suggest. So just very quickly, walking through what we do, shareholder letters were often the most direct form of communication for a company with its shareholders. And so what we did was we went back to 1955 and picked up all the shareholder letters from large corporations to their shareholders, basically the Fortune 150, which is 120 industrial and 30 financial. And we study those letters to see what goals do CEOs want to project. How did this change over time? What influence did Friedman have, for example? We sort of see him as Machiavellian. Did he have much influence in what corporations do and say? And finally, is this simply marketing or does it have real consequences? So let's go with that. Now, we study letters from 1955. 8,962 letters is what we found out of a total of possible 9,900. Reasons why you can't find them all. It's impossible to read through 8,962 letters and keep your sanity. So we did some machine learning here. But let me give you an example of a letter. This is Amazon, right? And if you read the text here, it's basically shareholder value over the long term is important. And the way we're going to create this is by improving our market position to one of leadership. In other words, we're going to create shareholder value by encompassing the market. Essentially what Adam Smith was worried about, right? But in this case, one of the more efficient firms, though my wife here complains about Amazon's efficiency. It's getting worse and worse. But the point is that these two problems are still with us, even in Amazon's explicit letter to their shareholders. But this is an example of what they say their objective is, long-term shareholder value, partly by creating a market leadership position, which will help them do all sorts of good stuff. So we looked through these letters, and we found essentially 13 broad objectives. The first is two ways of looking at shareholder value. One is where they say, look, we are about profits, or we are about reducing costs, we are about increasing return on assets, different ways of saying we care about the bottom line. Then within those objectives, we looked for when they said we want to maximize shareholder value. So when I say shareholder value narrow, it's a narrower form of shareholder value where they explicitly say we're going to maximize shareholder value. Then there are other objectives. Growth is always an objective for many corporations. We want to increase the growth in sales. Innovation for some corporations. They want to manage risks or debt in another set. And then stakeholders. We care about our customers. We care about employees. We care about the community. We care about all stakeholders. And finally, corporations increasingly are talking about public objectives. We are a company with ethics. We care about philanthropy. We care about social purpose, diversity and inclusion, or we care about the environment. So there are 13 broad objectives. And what do we see happen in terms of trends? One, we see an explosion in the number of goals that corporations say they're about. Look at this chart. The green line is telling you what fraction of corporations have more than one goal. It turns out it was about 20%. It's now 100%. Every company has more than one goal. Nobody just says shareholder value maximization. They all have more than one goal, and the number of companies with zero goals has basically gone to zero. But if you look at the number of goals companies have, it's gone from conditional on having a goal, it was 2 goals. Now it's conditional on having a goal, it is 7.5. So companies say they do everything, right? Here's an example of a company which says it does everything. International Paper. And I've summarized the goals, so there were more. We're going to be sustainable, responsible forest stewardship, improve the lives of our employees, address critical needs in the community, work to reduce emissions. What else? We're going to create long-term value for all stakeholders, increase cost of capital. This is somebody who would well sign on to that Business Roundtable statement, right? They're going to be good to everyone. And this is the trend. More and more corporations are saying, we're going to be good to everyone, okay? What's the next trend? Most firms mentioned a shareholder-oriented goal even before the 1970s. So it wasn't Milton Friedman who started this off. It happened before Friedman. When it exploded was not after his famous New York Times article, or it wasn't in the 1960s with Free to Choose, where there are elements of shareholder value maximization. If you look at this graph, basically Friedman is not a blip, okay? Really, everything takes off in the 1980s. And the reason it takes off, I'll come to in a second, is because we had the rise of institutional shareholders and the rise of the takeover movement. And corporations responded by saying, we're for shareholders. Because we've gone off track, we are really for shareholders. So the blue line here is corporations saying they maximize some notion of profits or minimize costs, et cetera. And you see that has been steadily increasing over time, from 40% of the corporations saying they do that to nearly 100%. Where they specifically talk about shareholder value, it starts really in the 1980s, not after Milton Friedman's article, but really in the 1980s. Though you see the occasional corporation saying that before. But it takes off in the 1980s. And importantly, see that blip down? That's for real. Corporations today, fewer and fewer of them are saying we maximize shareholder value, perhaps because it's impolitic to say that. Do they not do it? We'll come to that in a second. Okay, so the last trend I want to talk about is the surge in stakeholder goals. I showed you shareholder goals went up in the 1980s. It turns out stakeholder goals also went up at the same time. Companies said they were about many stakeholders, employees, customers, et cetera. They also started saying in fits and starts that they were about society, about the environment, about maximizing diversity and inclusion. I want to just take you to the diversity and inclusion goal, which is what we call ESG social. See the blip up from 1955 to 1970. This is representing how many companies increased their mention of diversity and inclusion as a goal. During the civil rights movement, many companies in the United States said we're about diversity and inclusion. But in the 70s in the 70s, many of them dropped that statement. This was when you had Nixon's Southern strategy, race came off the boil, it was no longer a big issue. It's no longer a big issue for companies. They dropped mention of it. When does it pick up again? Most recently, 2010 to 2020, with all the Black Lives Matter, with George Floyd. Again, companies are saying, we care about diversity and inclusion. In other words, companies are really sensitive to the politics of the moment and react accordingly. React negatively also in the sense that they dropped. It's not that they always talk about a goal. If the goal is impolitic at a particular point, they drop it. And then they pick it up later when it becomes more political to say that. So let me, in the last, I want to leave some time for questions, maybe 8 minutes, talk about why do firms' goals change over time, and can we say something about what firms maximize today based on that. And I would argue here are some of the reasons we pick up. One, they respond to changes in the audience power. When the audience changes or their power changes, they change. They also change with the audience preferences. When the public cares about something else, corporations care about something else. So they are creatures that have a responsiveness to the public. They also try and use their statement of objectives to commit either to a specific set of stakeholders or to improve the firm's specific situation. And finally, they also announce objectives to deflect pressures. So there is an element of agency also still embedded in this. So let's start first with responding to changes in audience power. You see, with an increase in institutional ownership after the 1980s, or the increase in hostile takeovers, you see a big increase in the companies that say we care about shareholders. And you can see this in the regressions, which I'll show you in a second. I don't have a lot of time to go into the details of the regression. A second reason that companies started talking about customers is because of heightened competition in the product markets. Remember, in the 1980s, there was huge competition for American cars from the Japanese. American companies became more sensitive to customer needs and started saying that in their objective function, and you see that in the regressions. I'm not going to have a lot of time to go through these regressions. What's on the left-hand side is, does the company state shareholder value in this case as an objective or not? And it turns out the more institutional ownership or the more takeover pressure, the more it does that. These are quick and dirty correlations. I don't want to impute a whole lot of causality. I just want to say that they're consistent with a broader sense of why this happens. And obviously, we need a more careful causal investigation. Similarly, if you look at foreign competition, how many companies announce customer goals? It turns out, if you're an industry with more imports, as well as an industry which is more sensitive to customers, the interaction within the two is a strong influence on whether you declare a customer objective. So companies in customer-facing industries, which face a lot of foreign competition in the 80s, basically announce more of a customer goal. That's the import of these regressions. A second reason for companies is changing audience preferences, okay? And one example of this is important events and public perception. So here what I have in the blue line is whether companies announce an ethics goal. And you can see it goes up tremendously in the early 2000s. And so we go around and look at what happened in the early 2000s. It's one name which strikes you, Enron. Enron happened, accounting fraud, suddenly companies are all about ethics. We care about values, we care about, it goes down after the furor about Enron dies down. The red line is how many times the word accounting fraud appears in the New York Times. So it's a measure of public perception, and you see a correlation between public perception and private company objectives. And you can do this for environment. Environmental sort of attention picks up around oil spills. And you see that soon after oil spills, energy companies soon declare an environmental objective. And it happens every time there's a big oil spill, which is about every 10 years. So they do respond to audience preferences. They also announce goals to commit to improve firm-specific situations. Here's an example. When they do badly in performance, they announce a shareholder objective. When their profits are low or their Tobin skew is low, the market doesn't value them very much, they're more likely to announce a shareholder objective. That's what the import of these regressions are. When they're fined by the EPA, that's when they announce an environmental objective. So, you know, you can take the negative view, this is fluff, this is deflection. You can take the positive view, they're committing to do better. They just got fined. Similarly, Coke was fined for its diversity practices. It then says, we're for diversity. So you can be cynical, you can be, and finally, they respond to specific stakeholders. So remember I talked about Google and Maven and said they cared about their employees? Well, that's a more general point here. When you look at companies that are in industries that pay their employees a lot, these are companies that also emphasize an employee objective. So if you value your employees because they're highly skilled, et cetera, you tend to be more likely to announce employee objectives. Of course, we can debate these regressions for a long time. These are just quick and dirty to show you these correlations. And finally, deflect pressure. I mean, some of all this could be seen as companies deflecting pressure. One example is the so-called opioid seven. 7 firms, some retail firms, were accused of exacerbating the opioid crisis by selling too easily these opioids in the market. There were 7 large firms. It turns out, as the crisis sort of comes out in the public, suddenly these companies announce a whole variety of objectives, not just ethics, but everything else also. The only thing to surmise from that is its deflection. We're about everything good. Why? Because we did something bad. And therefore, we're trying to deflect attention at that point. So these objectives do serve a little bit of a PR purpose also. The final question is, do managers mean what they say when they say all this? And there, I think the evidence is a little bleaker. If you look at fixed salary, it's about 11% of compensation. Long-term incentive programs are 70% of compensation. Long-term incentive programs are almost entirely about financial performance because they can't be about anything else. So 70% of compensation is tied to financial performance, which is shareholder value. The annual bonus, 19%, can be tied to some of these other metrics, stakeholders, et cetera. It turns out when you look at the overall time, it's between 2.5% to 4.5%. That's how much of a manager's compensation is tied to all this other stuff, environment, ESG, et cetera, et cetera. That's minuscule, right? And so in that sense, what you could argue is that this doesn't matter. Now, cup is half empty for that reason. Here's the half full part. When they do compensate, they compensate things like ESG environment, ESG social. If you do progress on the environment, progress on the social, there is some element of compensation devoted to that. So it's not entirely fluff. There is a certain amount of compensation for this stuff. Now, you could argue that, why are they compensating this stuff, but not the others? Why aren't they compensating for your treating employees better? Why aren't they compensating for your treating, customers better? It may be the answer is that the goals are just a sideshow, but it may also be that, all this other stuff is part of shareholder value maximization in the long term, treating my employees better, as I talked about with Google. But what is left out is the true externality, the environment, diversity. And it's heartening that companies that want to emphasize that as a goal also compensate for that as, however small, they do compensate a little bit. So that is the cup half full part. And last point, do the stated goals make a difference in performance? And let me basically say, look, Sustainalytics is a company which looks at ESG performance and ranks companies on that basis. It turns out companies that announce ESG goals tend to do better on Sustainalytics. So that's the good news. Companies that the left-hand side is the score, and the right-hand side is whether they announce those as a goal, turns out strongly correlated. The problem, however, is when you look at the details. How is it that they're doing better on the Sustainalytics score? It turns out they're doing better because they check all the boxes in terms of, do you have this process? Do you have this committee? Do you measure this? If you look at the measures of performance, do they do better on emissions? Do they do better in having fewer EPA fines? No evidence that there's any difference. So again, half full, half empty. They check the boxes. They do wonderfully on the Sustainalytics score. But we still have to see that they go beyond that. They seem to be. Last point, what about long-term performance? Again, no evidence that maximizing shareholder value or anything of that sort has anything to do with long-term performance. So bottom line, and let me sum up, business goals have proliferated over time for a variety of reasons, which we've talked about, but they have limited consequences for long-term performance. And maybe part of the reason they announced them is to deflect political pressure. But it does go back to really this bottom line. We can't ignore the politics. Corporations are subject to outside political and competitive pressure as well as internal pressures. And we need some combination of these pressures to make sure they solve both the problems that Adam Smith was worried about, the agency problem and the public purpose problem. And Friedman is only a partial solution. He oversimplified. Similarly, the stakeholder view or the purpose view oversimplifies. And we have to be realistic that the answer probably lies in a combination of both the public forces as well as the internal incentives, which then leads to the bottom line for the question I started this talk with. Can corporations help us save the planet? Not really, but they can help. But for that, we have to get government back on track. In other words, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. That's probably the message of this talk. Let me stop there.
Okay, I think we've got a few minutes left for questions because we started about 5 or so minutes late. So let's take some questions. There's microphones there. So first question here.
Thank you, Professor Rajan, for this fascinating talk. A lot of the stock traders are institutional investors these days. And when they trade stocks, and they have social preferences, and that will affect the asset prices. So in that sense, it affects the cost of financing for the firms. So if we take the view that there's social preferences affecting the financing cost of the firm, the stochastic discount factor, so the firm manager, even though they maximize profits, they indirectly take into account the social preferences of those shareholders through the cost of financing. So this is different, I suppose, to the progressive view in terms of putting the shareholders' social preferences directly into the manager's objective. And I wonder what your thoughts are on this. Thank you.
It's a great point. One of the things I skipped was this discussion of the principles of responsible investing, which was a Kofi Annan-led sort of idea that institutional investors should imbibe these principles of responsible investing, many of which have these social preferences embedded in them. A lot of managers signed on, institutional managers signed on to these PRI principles. And you could argue that through their agency, this is imposed to some extent on the corporations. And precisely maximizing shareholder value now becomes, in a sense, maximizing those preferences. Though you want to be a little careful, as my colleague Lubos Pastor, he did this piece, which showed that green-oriented companies did particularly well because of this institutional preference. The problem, of course, is once the prices have risen because of that, it is possible that the brown-oriented companies now become attractive because they are undervalued, and then there's a reason to go there. So it can be more complicated than simply rewarding those who do good, because of course there's a price which also adjusts in the process. But that's certainly something which, and I didn't talk about PRI, which has been a big factor in companies increasing their goals.
Thanks.
I had a question about company letters and more generally communication by chief executives to the outside world. And I wondered whether you thought that the audience that companies were talking to in those letters has changed, in the sense that maybe in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, maybe in the 1990s as well, those letters were for shareholders, bondholders, maybe for banks as well, telling you what the objectives of the company were. But that increasingly now actually you're talking to the customers, and there's a kind of defensive strategy. You don't want to be the company that doesn't mention diversity, environment, climate. So they're no longer really talking to the same people as they were in the 20th century. And maybe, crude sociology, in the 20th century, your customers just wanted the best car or oven or whatever it was that they were going to buy, and weren't particularly interested or less interested than they now are in, well, what are the values of the company? And so that's why now every company wants to be talking about climate, environment, diversity, inclusion. But it's really a kind of defensive strategy that if you don't talk about those things, you might lose your customers.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's part of what's going on. The preferences of the audience have changed. But also, I thought you were getting at this idea that the ways of communication have also changed. So, in fact, one of the things we find surprisingly is we can't find many recent letters because some companies just stopped writing. They find it easy to just communicate via their website or their Facebook and many companies now have additional sort of documents they put out. It used to be, the press used to look at this for the company's position. And of course, now they have different ways of interacting with the press. It doesn't have to just be the printed shareholder letter. So both the audience preferences as well as the ways of communication have changed. That said, I think you're right in that they're reflecting to some extent the public mood. Absolutely.
Thanks. So one question from Jagjit, and then final question over there. Yeah, if you could be quick.
Sure. Thank you, Ragaram. A wonderful talk this morning. I'm slightly scared of asking you this question, given you're from Chicago, but I couldn't help thinking that you're drawing this link consistently between corporations and the operation of government, that I don't think you mentioned corporation tax once in your talk. And if you take a look at the UK numbers, I don't know the US numbers, but we're raising about 20 to 25% of GDP from income taxes, national insurance, and VAT, and about 2 to 3% only from corporation taxes. And I'm aware of the supply side issues connected with raising corporation taxes, but I can't help thinking, by paying your tax, you're sending a pretty good signal about your values and your support of society. And I wonder whether that's something you might want to consider in future work.
A good question. I think the US numbers are similar. But, what would the corporate reaction be to that statement? Well, we're paying our employees, and employees are paying taxes. We're paying, sales tax or VAT or whatever. Look, we haven't gone into detail there, but that's sort of part of the privileges issue, right, which has been running right through. What is the corporate privilege? And to what extent is it excessive? Should they be paying a fair share rather than lobbying to reduce their share? And I think that question is still up there.
And final question.
Hello. So if we are really taking these multiple goals of a corporation as a serious thing, then as we know from political economics, preference aggregation is not an easy thing to do. It requires advanced institutions. So perhaps we should see a rise or a change of institutions within like corporate governance, I don't know, like separation of power within the firm or something like that, that the firm now more resembles a state? Because how otherwise it could like aggregate preferences of investors?
It's a very difficult issue, right? We talked earlier about this institutions following principles for responsible investing. But how much weight do they put on each? Who monitors the monitor? How much do they put on that? And then how does that filter into the corporation? So every board, I mean, I'm sure some of you are on boards, you know they're trying to grapple with these issues. How much weight do we put on ESG and so on? They certainly feel they have to. But how do those weights play out? How do you elicit preferences of the various stakeholders? That's why I said there are no clean answers. It's really all about muddling through. And you only know they've gone off track when you see a Silicon Valley bank collapse, and then you say, well, this went too far in one direction, and then you try and course correct. But to course correct, you need responsible government also, and that's why I'm saying you need a little bit of both. Thank you very much.
Thanks.